A man sits cross-legged in total darkness. The space around him measures no larger than a coffin, hidden inside a wall where steel panels separate him from the world outside. He's meditating, waiting, breathing in the stale air of his makeshift tomb. Outside that wall, police officers in riot gear grip a massive circular saw. Millions of people watch on television as the blade cuts through metal, the screech echoing across Japan. They're looking for the man who claimed he could levitate, the man who said he was Christ reborn, the only soul who held the key to surviving the coming apocalypse. This man convinced his followers to drink his bathwater, believing it contained spiritual power. He sold them vials of his bodily fluids for thousands of dollars, promising enlightenment. Scientists with advanced degrees abandoned their research to wear electrical caps that supposedly synchronize their brainwaves with his. Young graduates from Japan's most prestigious universities traded microscopes and particle accelerators for something else entirely. Syringes filled with poison, laboratories manufacturing nerve gas, plans to bring about the end of the world. When they released sarin into Tokyo's subway system during the morning rush hour, when the nerve agent-filled train cars carrying thousands of commuters to work, the world learned something it had somehow failed to notice. Meditation classes could become weapons factories. Yoga studios could transform into terrorist cells. A partially blind man from a poor family could build Japan's deadliest organization right under the nose of one of the world's most advanced governments. This is the story of Aum Shinrikyo. This is the story of how a one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo became the headquarters for mass murder. How warning signs were dismissed. How families watched their children disappear into communes. How a lawyer and his wife and infant son were injected with poison in the middle of the night. How brilliant minds convinced themselves that killing was compassion, that apocalypse was salvation, that one man's vision justified any atrocity. The story begins not with poison gas or subway stations, but with a 6-year-old boy being sent away from home. It begins with darkness, with a school for the blind, with a child learning early that having even a little sight in a world of blindness could make you powerful. It begins with shame and failure, with fake medicine and bankruptcy, with a man who couldn't succeed in the ordinary world deciding to create his own. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey together, into the life of Chizuo Matsumoto, who would become Shoko Asahara, into the transformation of a yoga studio into a doomsday cult, into the question of how this happened, how it went unnoticed for so long, and why on March 20th, 1995, the Tokyo subway became a place of terror. Chizuo Matsumoto entered the world on March 2nd, 1955, in Yatsushiro, a city in Kumamoto Prefecture on the southern island of Kyushu. He was the 4th son born into a large family that made their living crafting tatami mats, those traditional straw floor coverings found in Japanese homes. The work was labor-intensive and the pay was modest. The Matsumoto family lived in poverty, cramped together in quarters too small for the number of children they were raising. Chizuo was born with infantile glaucoma, a hereditary eye disease that ran through the family bloodline. The condition left him completely blind in his left eye from birth. His right eye retained partial vision, enough to make out shapes and movement, enough to see light and shadow, but not enough to live what anyone would call a normal life. For a poor family already struggling to feed 5 children, a blind child represented an additional burden they could barely manage. When Chizuo turned 6 years old, his father made a decision that would shape everything that followed. The boy would be sent away to the Kumamoto School for the Blind, a boarding institution in the city of Kumamoto, far from his family home. At an age when most children are just beginning elementary school, still sleeping in their own beds and eating meals cooked by their mothers, Chizuo Matsumoto was placed in a dormitory with strangers. He would live there, isolated from his family, for the next 14 years. The schools for the handicapped in Japan had been linked with discrimination since the Meiji era, which began in 1868. When the Meiji government established a compulsory education system in 1872, it created separate institutions for disabled children, marking them as fundamentally different from the rest of society. This separation wasn't presented as a charitable accommodation, but as a necessity. These children belonged in their own world, away from ordinary society. For Chizuo, this isolated environment became his entire universe. The Kumamoto School for the Blind was its own closed society, with its own hierarchies, its own power structures, its own rules that existed nowhere else. And in this particular kingdom, young Chizuo Matsumoto discovered something important about himself. Having any sight at all, even partial vision in just one eye, made you powerful. Former teachers and students from that era later recalled how the school functioned. Those students who were completely blind depended on those who could see even a little. A classmate who could make out shapes could guide others through hallways, could help them navigate the paths outside, could read signs and notices that existed only as textures under fingertips for those without sight. This created a dynamic that most sighted children never experience: vision as currency, sight as social capital. Students with complete blindness would approach those like Chizuo with requests. "I will buy you dinner if you take me out for coffee," they'd say. "Help me get to the tea room and I'll give you something in return." Former teachers remembered that Chizuo understood this economy well. He had sight when others didn't. He could do things they couldn't. And he learned, at a very young age, how to exploit that advantage. Those who knew him during those years described a boy who was intelligent, certainly, but also someone who showed a tendency toward domination. He enjoyed being needed, enjoyed having others depend on him, enjoyed the feeling of being essential to people who had no choice but to rely on his limited vision. In a school where almost everyone was more disabled than he was, Chizuo Matsumoto could be king. One of his former classmates would later make an observation that seems, in retrospect, almost prophetic. "When I look at the way Aum operates," this person said years after the subway attacks, "I think Matsumoto is trying to create a closed society like the school for the blind he went to. He is trying to create a society separate from ordinary society in which he can become king of the castle." For 14 years, from age 6 to age 20, Chizuo lived in this isolated institution. 14 years of dormitory life, of being separate from the mainstream world, of existing in a place where the normal rules didn't apply. 14 years of learning that in a small, closed system, someone with even a slight advantage could become powerful. 14 years of understanding that creating dependency was a form of control. When he graduated from the Kumamoto Prefectural School for the Blind in 1975, Chizuo Matsumoto had plans. He wanted to attend Tokyo University, Japan's most prestigious institution, the school that produced the nation's leaders and intellectuals. He wanted to prove that a partially blind boy from a poor family could rise to the highest levels of Japanese society. He wanted, more than anything, to be someone important in the conventional world. But Chizuo Matsumoto remained at the blind school for 2 more years after graduating. He took the entrance exams for Kumamoto University first. He failed. He moved to a preparatory school in Tokyo in 1977, studying day and night, convinced that with enough preparation, he could pass the entrance exams for Tokyo University. He failed again. And then he failed again. The doors that opened for other young Japanese men, those with proper vision and proper families and proper educational backgrounds, remained closed to Chizuo Matsumoto. He would never attend Tokyo University. He would never become the conventional success he'd imagined during those years at the blind school. So he did what many blind people in Japan did when academic paths closed to them. He studied acupuncture and traditional Chinese medicine. These were considered appropriate careers for the blind, acceptable occupations that acknowledged his disability while still allowing him to make a living. In 1978, he married Tomoko Ishii, a college student he'd met in Tokyo. She would eventually bear him 6 children. He opened a pharmacy in the city of Chiba, specializing in Chinese medicaments, herbs, and traditional remedies that he sold to customers looking for alternatives to Western medicine. For a while, based on what records exist, it seems that Chizuo Matsumoto tried to build a normal life. He had a wife, a growing family, a business. He was making his way in the world, even if it wasn't the way he'd originally envisioned. He was selling medicine, supporting his family, doing what was expected of him. Then came 1982, and everything changed. The police arrested Chizuo Matsumoto for practicing pharmacy without a license and for selling unregulated fake cures. The medications he'd been selling, the remedies he'd marketed as traditional Chinese medicine, were fraudulent. Some contained no active ingredients at all. Others contained substances that had no business being called medicine. The arrest made the newspapers. The trial was public. The shame was acute. The court convicted him and fined him 200,000 yen, which was roughly $800 at the time. His business collapsed. The pharmacy went bankrupt. And according to those who knew the family during this period, Chizuo and his wife were so mortified by what neighbors thought that they stopped leaving their home except to buy absolute essentials. They became prisoners in their own apartment, trapped by shame, unable to face the judgment of people who had once been their customers. This public humiliation seems to have broken something in Chizuo Matsumoto, or perhaps it revealed something that had been there all along. If he couldn't succeed in conventional society, if the doors of academia and respectability were closed to a partially blind man who tried and failed to prove himself, then perhaps he needed to create his own society. One where the normal rules didn't apply. One where he made the rules. One where he could be, once again, the king of the castle. Sitting in that apartment, unable to show his face to his neighbors, Chizuo Matsumoto began studying religion with an intensity he'd never applied to anything else. He started with Chinese astrology and Taoism. Then he moved to Western esotericism, exploring occult traditions from Europe. He practiced yoga, learned meditation techniques, dove into esoteric Buddhism and esoteric Christianity. He let his hair grow long. He let his beard grow wild. He stopped caring what he looked like to ordinary society because he was preparing to stop being part of ordinary society altogether. In 1984, Chizuo Matsumoto joined Agonshu, a new religious movement that emphasized deliverance from earthly bondage. Agonshu taught transmigration of souls and recommended practicing mental and physical asceticism to attain nirvana. Many young Japanese people were drawn to Agonshu during this period, seeking spiritual meaning in a society they found too materialistic, too focused on economic success and conventional achievement. It's common, according to scholars who study Japanese new religions, for founders of these movements to start their religious careers because of difficulties they faced in everyday life. Shizuo Matsumoto seems to have followed this pattern precisely. His failures in Kumamoto, his failures in Tokyo, his arrest and bankruptcy, all of this appears to have driven him toward proving his superiority in the spiritual world, since he couldn't prove it in the material one. Through yoga practice, he worked to develop what he would later call supernatural powers. Based on his later claims, he became obsessed with the idea of enlightenment, of achieving states of consciousness that would elevate him above ordinary people, above those who had rejected him, above the society that had refused to let a partially blind man from a poor family become someone important. By 1984, he had gathered a small group of followers. With these devotees, he started a yoga center that he called Aum Shinsen no Kai, the Aum Immortal Mountain Wizard Association. According to his own writings, he would soon change his name to Shoko Asahara after experiencing what he described as a spiritual awakening in the Himalayas. And from his participation in Agonshu, he learned something extremely valuable: the organizational know-how to run a religious association. He learned how to recruit, how to structure a following, how to create the appearance of legitimacy. The blind boy from Kumamoto, the failed student, the disgraced pharmacy owner, was about to become something else entirely. He was about to become a guru. And the small yoga center he started in 1984 would become, within a decade, one of the most dangerous organizations in Japanese history. In 1987, Shoko Asahara, as he now called himself, officially founded Aum Shinrikyo in a one-bedroom apartment in Tokyo's Shibuya ward. The name combined the Sanskrit syllable Aum, which represents the universe in Hindu and Buddhist tradition, with Shinrikyo, which roughly translates to teaching of truth. Aum, supreme truth. The organization that would change Japan forever started as nothing more than a yoga and meditation class in a cramped apartment. The early advertisements were simple. Asahara handed out flyers on street corners, posted notices in occult magazines, placed small ads in underground publications with names like The Moo and The Twilight Zone. These magazines catered to people interested in the paranormal, the supernatural, the mystical, exactly the demographic Asahara was targeting. The flyer that apparently attracted the most attention featured a photograph of Asahara himself, seated in the lotus position, appearing to hover several inches above the floor. Levitation achieved through meditation, the caption claimed. The photograph made its way into several Japanese periodicals focused on occult subjects. And based on later testimony from early followers, this image of a man defying gravity through spiritual power drew people in. What the photograph didn't show was the moment it was actually taken. According to those who were present, Asahara had been bouncing in the lotus position in his apartment, and a follower with a camera had snapped the picture at the precise peak of the bounce, the instant when he was briefly airborne. It wasn't levitation. It was a well-timed photograph, but it looked impressive, and it suggested that this partially blind yoga instructor had mastered something extraordinary. The timing of Asahara's emergence couldn't have been better. Japan in the mid-1980s was experiencing an economic miracle. The country had become one of the world's wealthiest nations. Japanese companies dominated global markets. Tokyo real estate became some of the most expensive on earth. But this material prosperity created a spiritual vacuum for many young Japanese people, particularly those from elite backgrounds who had followed all the rules, attended the right schools, landed the prestigious jobs, and found themselves asking, "Is this all there is?" This was the audience Asahara understood how to reach. In his yoga classes, in his meditation sessions, in the books he would begin publishing, he promised something that money couldn't buy and conventional society couldn't provide. He promised enlightenment. He promised spiritual power. He promised that you could become something more than just another salaryman in a corporation, just another cog in Japan's economic machine. The classes started small, perhaps a dozen people gathering in Asahara's apartment to practice yoga and learn meditation techniques. But they grew quickly. Young people, many of them university students or recent graduates, found something compelling in Asahara's teachings. He mixed elements of Buddhism and Hinduism with Christian concepts and prophecies from Nostradamus. He spoke about consciousness, about transcendence, about achieving states of being that most people never even knew were possible. And he was, according to those who knew him during this early period, remarkably charismatic. A lawyer who would later work with Aum told journalists that Asahara was very smart, knew how to argue effectively, was skilled at reading people and understanding how to unsettle them psychologically. Followers described him as warm, even cuddly, someone who could make you feel special, understood, important. In 1986, Asahara took a trip that would transform both his image and his organization. He traveled to the Himalayas, staying for a period with Buddhist monks in mountain retreats. When he returned to Japan, he announced that he had achieved enlightenment. He claimed to be the first Japanese person to attain nirvana. He said he had reached the highest level of consciousness possible for a human being. This journey to the Himalayas marked the moment when Chizuo Matsumoto fully became Shoko Asahara. The yoga instructor became a guru. The failed pharmacy owner became a spiritual master. And his following began to grow in ways that must have shocked even him. By 1989, Aum Shinrikyo had gained something critically important: official status as a religious organization from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. This designation wasn't just symbolic. Under Japanese religious corporation law, it granted Aum massive tax breaks and, perhaps most significantly, de facto immunity from official oversight. Once recognized as a religious corporation, authorities were not permitted to investigate the group's religious activities or doctrine. What Aum called spiritual practice, the government couldn't touch. This protection would prove catastrophic. But at the time, Aum Shinrikyo looked like just another of the many new religions that had emerged in Japan since World War II. The country had hundreds of these movements, most of them harmless, all of them protected by laws designed to prevent the government from interfering with religious freedom. Aum appeared, to bureaucrats reviewing the paperwork, to be nothing more than a yoga school with Buddhist and Hindu elements. There seemed no reason to deny them religious status. What made Aum different from most other new religions wasn't immediately apparent from the outside, but it became clear soon enough once you looked at who was joining. Aum Shinrikyo was attracting graduates from Japan's elite universities: Tokyo University, Kyoto University, Osaka University, Waseda University. These weren't gullible people with limited education. These were some of the brightest young minds in Japan, people who had succeeded in the conventional world and then chosen to leave it behind. Seiichi Endo left prestigious Kyoto University, where he had been doing experiments in genetic engineering at the medical school's Viral Research Center. He was 28 years old when he joined Aum, abandoning cutting-edge scientific research to become one of Asahara's key engineers. Masami Tsuchiya was a first-rate graduate student at the University of Tsukuba, 24 years old, working on organic chemistry at an advanced level. He walked away from his academic career to join the cult. Fumihiro Joyu arrived with an advanced degree in telecommunications from Waseda University, where he had studied artificial intelligence. He was 26 and had been working as an engineer at Japan's National Space Development Agency before joining Aum. He later said he was drawn in by the spirituality of yoga and meditation, by the promise of something deeper than programming computers for the space program. And then there was Hideo Murai, an astrophysicist. He was brilliant, intense, soft-spoken, and fascinated by the question of how levitation and telepathy might actually be possible from a scientific standpoint. After reading one of Asahara's books, Murai lost interest in his career studying the cosmos and became interested instead in studying Asahara. He would become Aum Shinrikyo's chief scientist and, as one journalist later called him, the engineer of the apocalypse. These men, and dozens, and, like them, represent one of the most troubling aspects of the Aum Shinrikyo story. These weren't people who lacked education or critical thinking skills. They were scientists, engineers, doctors, lawyers, people trained to question, to analyze, to demand evidence. And yet they abandoned promising careers to follow a partially blind man who claimed he could levitate, who sold his bathwater to followers, who said he was Christ reborn. What was it about Asahara that drew these brilliant young people in? Some have suggested it was the materialism of 1980s Japan, the sense that economic success didn't bring meaning. Others point to Asahara's genuine skill as a storyteller, his ability to create a compelling narrative about enlightenment and cosmic purpose. Still others note the appeal of community, of belonging to something that felt important and world-changing. But there was also something darker at work, something that became more apparent as Aum grew larger. Asahara wasn't just offering spiritual teachings. He was offering initiations, experiences, methods that supposedly accelerated the path to enlightenment. And many of these methods involved what can only be described as extreme psychological manipulation. The recruitment methods Aum used were aggressive and sophisticated. The organization established what it called the New Followers Agency, an entire division dedicated solely to bringing in new members. Beyond basic techniques like handing out flyers and street corner proselytizing, Aum used its commercial enterprises as recruitment tools. The group operated computer stores, bookstores, noodle shops, all of them staffed by Aum members who would introduce customers to the teachings. They broadcast their message through a Russian radio station and used Russian television shows to recruit there as well. And then there were the classes themselves: yoga, herbal healing, meditation, offered on university campuses across Japan. Young students seeking stress relief or spiritual meaning would attend a class, find it compelling, and gradually be drawn deeper into the organization. Some experts who studied Aum later contended that the group's success in recruitment wasn't just about charisma or clever marketing. It was also, they believed, about the use of psychedelic and mind-altering drugs during the initiation process. The initiation rituals that Aum conducted were extreme by any standard. What the group called yoga often involved practices that had nothing to do with traditional yoga. Members were hung upside down for extended periods. Some received shock therapy, which was framed as spiritual purification. Initiations frequently involved the use of hallucinogens, particularly LSD. One former member described what Aum called the Christ initiation, supposedly the highest form of religious indoctrination the group offered. 50 followers gathered in a room with Asahara. They drank a sweet liquid from a wine goblet. Then they were each placed in individual meditation cells, small isolated spaces where they would remain alone. Within 5 minutes, this former member told journalists, I was tripping on what I think was probably LSD. He described hearing people in other cells screaming and kicking the walls and doors. When they let me out 12 hours later, he said, it was like a scene in a mental hospital. I saw several unconscious people who had actually bitten into their wrists and were covered with blood. After this ordeal, those who survived the initiation and apparently passed some tests that Asahara had established were immersed in water so hot it burned their skin. The former member who described this experience said he passed the test with high marks and was given a high position in the cult. The psychological impact of such an experience is difficult to overstate. You've been given drugs without your full understanding, subjected to hours of isolation and hallucination, witnessed others in states of extreme distress, and then been told you've achieved something special, that you've proven yourself worthy. The practices Asahara instituted as Aum grew larger, created total dependency on him. Followers were required to drink his bathwater, which they believed contained spiritual power. He sold vials of his blood and other bodily fluids for enormous sums, sometimes tens of thousands of dollars, claiming these substances could transfer his enlightenment to others. Members wore strange electrical caps that were supposed to synchronize their brainwaves with Asahara's, allowing them to think as he thought. In meetings, Asahara always sat one level higher than his followers. They had to bow before him, and in some ceremonies, they had to kiss his toe as a sign of submission. One follower later recalled discovering that he was carrying a picture of an Indian saint in his pocket. When Asahara found out, this person said, he went berserk and said, I should not respect anyone but him. The control was absolute. The isolation was complete. Asahara demanded that followers give up everything, their families, their careers, their possessions, their very identities. Those who joined Aum fully, becoming what the group called renunciants, would move into communal facilities. They would sign over their assets to the organization. They would cut all contact with the outside world and devote themselves entirely to achieving the enlightenment that only Asahara could provide. By the late 1980s, Aum Shinrikyo had established multiple communes, large facilities where hundreds of followers lived together in what they called a sangha, a community of seekers devoted to spiritual practice. From the outside, these compounds looked like religious retreat centers. Inside, they functioned as closed societies, completely cut off from mainstream Japan, operating under rules that existed nowhere else. Asahara had succeeded in creating exactly what his former classmate had predicted, a closed society separate from ordinary society, where he was king of the castle. The blind boy from Kumamoto, who had learned at age 6 how having even partial sight could make you powerful in a world of blindness, had now created a world where he was the only one who could truly see. He was the enlightened one. He was the guru. He was as he would soon declare, Christ himself. And his followers, brilliant scientists and engineers who had once studied the mysteries of the physical universe, now studied only one mystery, the will of Shoko Asahara. Whatever he said was true. Whatever he commanded was righteous. Whatever he wanted would be done. The stage was set for something terrible. All that remained was for Asahara to decide what he wanted. And as the 1990s began, what he wanted was becoming increasingly clear. He wanted to hasten the apocalypse. He wanted to prove his prophecies correct. He wanted to be the one man standing when the world burned. He wanted, in other words, to bring about the end times. And he had an army of true believers ready to help him do it. As Aum Shinrikyo grew larger through the late 1980s, something changed in Shoko Asahara. Those who knew him from the early yoga classes remember someone who still practiced regularly, who maintained at least some connection to the physical and spiritual disciplines that had originally attracted followers. But as his power grew, as his following expanded into the thousands, Asahara increasingly distanced himself from the actual practices he preached. According to those who observed him during this period, Asahara stopped performing the intense ascetic exercises he demanded from his disciples. He rarely moved from his elevated seat. He ate whatever he wanted, often rich foods, favorites that contrasted starkly with the severe dietary restrictions imposed on regular members. He had become, in every sense, a guru who no longer practiced what he preached. He simply preached, and others obeyed. This transformation from active yoga teacher to passive authority figure coincided with the first acts of violence within the group. In 1988, according to scholars who have studied Aum's evolution, the earliest incidents of physical punishment and abuse began occurring inside the communes. Members who showed doubt, who questioned teachings, who failed to demonstrate proper devotion, found themselves subjected to discipline that went far beyond anything spiritual. Then, in late 1988, came the first death. A 21-year-old disciple named Majima Terayuki died from a heart attack during a 24-hour meditation session in a dark room. The young man had been attempting one of Aum's extreme ascetic practices, extended meditation in complete darkness, without food or water, pushing his body and mind to their absolute limits in pursuit of enlightenment. When Terayuki's heart gave out and he died in that dark room, it created a profound crisis for Asahara. This wasn't supposed to happen. The practices were supposed to lead to salvation, to enlightenment, to transcendence. Instead, they had led to death. A young man who had trusted Asahara's teachings, who had followed the guru's instructions precisely, had died as a direct result. Any normal religious leader might have seen this as a moment to reconsider, to question whether the methods being used were too extreme, too dangerous. Asahara took a different path. If his religion was bringing death instead of salvation, then he needed to change the doctrine to make death part of salvation. This is when Asahara adopted the concept of Poa from Vajrayana, a branch of Tibetan Buddhism. In traditional Buddhist thought, Poa is a complex concept related to the transference of consciousness at death. But Asahara twisted it into something else entirely, a justification for murder. According to Asahara's version of Poa, killing someone who was accumulating bad karma was actually an act of compassion. You were freeing them from the bad karma they would otherwise accumulate, allowing them to be reborn in their next life with better karma. This theological framework, once established, opened a door that could never be closed. If murder could be justified as compassion, if killing was actually a form of salvation, then anything was permissible in service of the guru's vision. The religion that had started as yoga classes in a one-bedroom apartment now had a doctrine that sanctioned killing. The first people to die under this doctrine weren't outsiders. They were members of Aum itself, those who tried to leave, those who expressed doubt, those who threatened to expose what was happening inside the communes. These deaths were kept secret, the bodies hidden, the families told that their loved ones had simply moved to another facility or had gone into intense meditation training. But in 1989, Aum committed a murder that couldn't be hidden forever. And it involved someone outside the organization, someone whose disappearance would be noticed, someone whose family would demand answers. It involved a lawyer named Tsutsumi Sakamoto. Tsutsumi Sakamoto was 33 years old in 1989. He worked at a law firm in Yokohama and had become involved in helping families whose children had joined Aum Shinrikyo. These families were desperate. Their sons and daughters had disappeared into the communes, had cut off all contact, had signed over their savings and inheritance to the organization. Some parents hadn't spoken to their children in months or years. They needed legal help, and Sakamoto was willing to provide it. In 1988, Sakamoto established what was called the Coalition of Help for Those Affected by Aum Shinrikyo, later renamed the Aum Shinrikyo Victims Association. The group collected testimony from former members, from families of current members, from anyone who had information about what was really happening inside Aum's facilities. Sakamoto was building a case for a class action lawsuit that could potentially bankrupt the organization. As part of his investigation, Sakamoto initiated a blood test of Shoko Asahara. The guru had long claimed that his blood contained special properties, that supernatural power flowed through his veins, that this was why drinking his blood, or bathwater, could transfer enlightenment to followers. Sakamoto wanted to test these claims scientifically. The results, according to later testimony, showed nothing unusual, just ordinary blood from an ordinary man. The disclosure of these findings would potentially embarrass or damage Asahara's authority. But before Sakamoto could make the blood test results public, before he could file his lawsuit, something else happened. In October 1989, Tokyo Broadcasting System Television, known as TBS, interviewed Sakamoto for a special broadcast about Aum Shinrikyo. The interview was conducted on October 26th, and the program was scheduled to air on October 27th. What happened next represents one of the most egregious breaches of journalistic ethics in Japanese media history. TBS executives, under pressure from Aum officials, showed the recorded interview to members of Aum Shinrikyo before it aired. This violated every principle of protecting sources and maintaining editorial independence. But TBS did it anyway. During that viewing, Kiyohide Hayakawa, one of Aum's senior executives, took detailed notes on Sakamoto's personal information visible in the video. Details about where he lived, what he looked like, identifying information that could be used to find him. After seeing the interview, Aum officials pressured TBS to cancel the broadcast, and TBS complied. The interview never aired. The public never saw it. And Tsutsumi Sakamoto had no idea that Aum now knew exactly who he was and what he was planning. On October 31st, 1989, Hayakawa and another Aum official attempted to negotiate with Sakamoto, asking him to drop the lawsuit and cease his activities against the organization. Sakamoto refused. 4 days later, In the early morning hours of November 4th, 1989, 6 Aum Shinrikyo executives arrived at Sakamoto's condominium in Yokohama. The group included Hideo Murai, the astrophysicist who had become Aum's chief scientist. They came prepared with a pouch containing 14 hypodermic needles and a supply of potassium chloride. According to court testimony provided by the perpetrators years later, the original plan had been to kidnap Sakamoto from the Yokohama train station, inject him with the potassium chloride, and kill him somewhere private. But November 4th was a holiday, and Sakamoto didn't appear at the station. So the plan changed. They would go to his home instead. The Sakamoto family was asleep when the Aum members entered the apartment. Tsutsumi Sakamoto, 33 years old. His wife, Satoko, 29 years old. And their son, Tatsuhiko, 14 months old. The attackers injected all 3 family members with potassium chloride. The baby's face was covered with a cloth after the injection. Satoko Sakamoto died from the poison relatively quickly. But Tsutsumi didn't die as fast as the attackers expected. While he struggled, while he fought to save his wife and child, they strangled him. Then came the disposal. The Aum members placed each body in a metal drum. They took these drums to 3 separate rural locations in 3 different prefectures, hundreds of miles apart. Tsutsumi's body was hidden in Niigata Prefecture. Satoko's body went to Toyama Prefecture. The baby, Tatsuhiko, was buried in Nagano Prefecture. The separation was intentional. If one body was discovered, police wouldn't immediately connect it to the others. Before leaving the apartment, the attackers burned the bedsheets. They smashed the victim's teeth to frustrate identification. They threw their tools into the ocean. They tried to make it look as though the Sakamoto family had simply vanished, left no trace, disappeared into nothing. The bodies would remain hidden for 6 years. It would take that long before anyone proved that Aum Shinrikyo had murdered a lawyer, his wife, and their infant son. And by that time, the organization would have done much worse. In 1990, Aum Shinrikyo made a play for legitimate political power. Shoko Asahara and 24 other Aum members ran for seats in Japan's parliament. They campaigned wearing masks of Asahara's face, a bizarre spectacle that drew media attention but didn't win votes. Every single Aum candidate lost. The Japanese electorate rejected them completely. This political failure seems to have intensified Asahara's paranoia and his apocalyptic vision. If Aum couldn't take control of Japan through democratic means, if the ordinary people rejected his message, then perhaps the apocalypse needed to arrive sooner rather than later. Perhaps the only way to save the world was to destroy it first. Throughout the early 1990s, as Aum's membership continued to grow, eventually reaching an estimated 40,000 members worldwide, with significant followings in both Japan and Russia, Asahara's teachings became increasingly dark. He published books with titles that revealed his mindset. Shivering Predictions by Shoko Asahara, Declaring Myself Christ. His prophecies grew more specific and more violent. From now until the year 2000, he wrote, a series of violent phenomena filled with fear that are too difficult to describe will occur. Japan will turn into wasteland as a result of a nuclear weapons attack. This will occur from 1996 through January 1998. An alliance centering on the United States will attack Japan. In large cities in Japan, only 1/10 of the population will be able to survive. 9 out of 10 people will die. In another book, he declared, "I am certain that in 1997, Armageddon will break out." These weren't vague predictions about distant future disasters. These were specific dates, specific scenarios, specific claims that the world as everyone knew it would soon end. And critically, Asahara taught that only Aum members would survive this coming catastrophe. Only those who had achieved enlightenment under his guidance, only those who belonged to the organization, would inherit the earth after the apocalypse. This created a powerful psychological dynamic among followers. If you believed Asahara's prophecies, then staying with Aum wasn't just about spiritual growth. It was about literal survival. Leaving the group meant condemning yourself to death when the apocalypse arrived. Your family members, your friends outside Aum, they were all doomed unless they joined. The stakes couldn't be higher. But as time passed, Asahara seems to have realized something troubling. The apocalypse he kept predicting wasn't happening on its own. The years came and went, and the world kept functioning. Nuclear war didn't break out. Japan didn't turn into wasteland. His prophecies weren't coming true. For a lesser cult leader, this might have led to the classic crisis of prophecy failure, the moment when the predicted event doesn't occur and followers begin to doubt. But Asahara took a different approach. If the apocalypse wasn't arriving naturally, then he would make it happen himself. He would fulfill his own prophecies. He would force reality to match his vision. In 1993, Aum Shinrikyo began secretly manufacturing chemical and biological weapons. The scientists that Asahara had recruited, the brilliant graduates from Japan's elite universities, turned their knowledge toward creating instruments of mass death. They started with sarin, a nerve agent originally developed by Nazi scientists before World War II. In July 1993, Aum members sprayed large amounts of liquid containing Bacillus anthracis spores, anthrax, from a cooling tower on the roof of Aum's Tokyo headquarters. The goal was to start an epidemic that would kill thousands. The attack failed, resulting only in complaints about bad odors, but it showed Aum's willingness to attempt mass murder. Later that year, the group successfully tested sarin gas on sheep at Banjawarn Station, a remote property they'd acquired in Western Australia. 29 sheep died in the experiment. The test proved that Aum could manufacture a working nerve agent. Now, they just needed to decide where to use it. In December 1994 and January 1995, Aum chemist Masami Tsuchiya synthesized 100 to 200 grams of another nerve agent called VX. This was used for targeted assassinations, attacks on specific individuals rather than mass casualties. The attacks showed increasing sophistication and ruthlessness. Also in late 1994, Aum carried out what can only be described as a reorganization into a shadow government. The group was no longer calling itself just a religious organization. Internally, members referred to it as the Supreme State. Asahara was designated by the group's own internal law as the Holy Monk Emperor. They drafted a constitution spelling out the structure of this new nation and the duties of its citizens. One provision stated clearly, "Citizens shall be obligated to military service in order to protect the sacred law." Aum Shinrikyo had become, in its own eyes, a sovereign nation at war with Japan, and Shoko Asahara was preparing to launch the first major battle. On the night of June 27, 1994, residents of Matsumoto, a city of several 100,000 people in Nagano Prefecture, began calling emergency services. People were collapsing in the streets. Others were vomiting, having difficulty breathing, experiencing vision problems. Something was terribly wrong, but no one could identify what. The substance causing these symptoms was sarin gas, released by Aum Shinrikyo members from a converted refrigerator truck parked in the Kita Fukashi residential district. The attack had two goals. First, to kill 3 judges who were presiding over a real estate lawsuit that Aum was losing. Second, to test how effective sarin would be as a weapon of mass murder in a real-world setting. The judges lived in the targeted neighborhood. Aum's original plan had been to release the sarin inside the Matsumoto courthouse itself, but when the attackers arrived, the building had already closed for the day. So they drove to the residential area and released the gas there instead, exposing not just the judges, but hundreds of innocent people. 7 people died that night from sarin exposure. An 8th victim would die in 2008 from long-term complications. Around 500 others were injured, many suffering permanent disabilities from the nerve agent. Some lost significant vision. Others developed chronic respiratory problems. The psychological trauma affected the entire community. The police investigation that followed represents one of the most shameful chapters in the case. Instead of identifying Aum Shinrikyo as the perpetrator, investigators focused their attention on an innocent local resident named Yoshiyuki Kono. They accused him of mixing chemical fertilizer incorrectly and accidentally creating a toxic cloud. For over a year, Kuno lived under a cloud of suspicion, portrayed in media reports as potentially responsible for killing his neighbors. He would remain under investigation until July 1995, when Aum members finally confessed to the Matsumoto attack. Matsumoto should have been a warning. National newspapers began linking various Aum-related disappearances and incidents, sensing that something significant was happening. By January 1995, evidence was pointing more and more toward Asahara and his organization. But the police, for reasons that would later be questioned extensively, didn't move decisively enough. In March 1995, Japanese authorities finally made plans to simultaneously raid Aum facilities across the country. They had accumulated enough evidence to justify major action. Search warrants were prepared, tactical teams were assembled. The raids were scheduled for late March. But according to prosecutors, Shoko Asahara learned about the coming raids in advance. 2 cult members inside the Japan Self-Defense Forces apparently tipped him off. This advance warning put Asahara in a desperate position. If police raided Aum facilities, they would find the chemical weapons laboratories, the stores of sarin and VX, the evidence of murders and kidnappings. Everything would be exposed. Aum Shinrikyo would be finished. Asahara had to do something dramatic, something that would divert police attention, create chaos, perhaps even trigger the apocalypse he'd been predicting. He ordered an attack on Tokyo itself. On March 18, 1995, Masami Tsuchiya was ordered to produce sarin again. Because the normal chemical precursors had already been destroyed or used up, the sarin manufactured for this attack was of lower quality than what had been used in Matsumoto. Forensic analysis would later show it was roughly half as pure. The inferior manufacturing process also gave the normally colorless sarin a brown tint, making it visible instead of invisible. 30 kilograms of this sarin was produced and stored in a large container. From there, it was carefully decanted into plastic bags. Each bag contained approximately 1 liter of liquid sarin. The bags were then wrapped in newspaper to make them easier to conceal and carry. The morning of March 20th, 1995 began like any other Monday in Tokyo. Millions of people woke up, got dressed for work, left their apartments and houses, and headed for the nearest station. The Tokyo subway system is one of the busiest in the world, with over 5 million riders daily moving through an intricate network of lines that connect every corner of the massive metropolitan area. 5 men boarded trains that morning, each on a different subway line. Each man carried bags wrapped in newspapers. Each bag contained liquid sarin. The 5 trains were all scheduled to arrive at Kasumigaseki Station, which serves Tokyo's government district within a 4-minute window between 8 o'clock and 8:10 a.m. The station is near the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department and multiple government offices. The 5 men wore ordinary clothes, but underneath they had protective layers. They carried sharpened umbrella tips concealed in their pockets. At the predetermined time, each man placed his newspaper-wrapped bags on the floor of the subway car. Then, using the sharpened umbrella tip, he punctured the plastic bags, allowing the liquid sarin to begin leaking out. As soon as the bags were punctured, each attacker exited the train at the next station and left the subway system entirely. Behind them, in those subway cars, the sarin began to evaporate. Liquid turned to gas. Gas filled the enclosed spaces. And people who had been on their way to work found themselves struggling to breathe, their vision going dark, their bodies convulsing, their lungs burning as the nerve agent did what nerve agents do, disrupted the signals between nerves and muscles, caused respiratory failure, created the conditions for suffocation, even though oxygen was present in the air. One witness later described seeing several dozen people on the platform who had either collapsed completely or were on their knees, unable to stand. One man was thrashing around on the floor like a fish out of water, this witness told journalists. Other passengers reported being suddenly unable to see. Their pupils contracted to pinpoints, their vision reduced to darkness. Some were shaking and trying to cry, but making no sound because the gas had affected their ability to vocalize. 5 subway stations on 3 different lines were affected that morning. The coordinated nature of the attack meant that reports came flooding in from multiple locations almost simultaneously. Emergency services were overwhelmed. Ambulances transported 688 patients. Nearly 5,000 additional people made their way to hospitals by other means, walking, taking taxis, being driven by friends or strangers who saw them collapsing on the street. In total, 278 hospitals across Tokyo saw 5,510 patients that day. 17 were deemed critical. 37 were in severe condition. Nearly 1,000 reported moderate illness, many with serious vision problems that would, in some cases, prove permanent. About 85% of those seeking medical attention were what doctors categorized as worried well, people who hadn't been directly exposed to sarin, but who had psychogenic symptoms caused by fear and panic. 13 people died that day from sarin exposure. A 14th victim would die later from complications. Thousands more suffered injuries ranging from temporary respiratory distress to permanent neurological damage. The Tokyo subway attack remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Japanese history. One Japanese government official called it a declaration of war against the Japanese government. And in a sense, that's exactly what it was. Shoko Asahara had taken his war against mainstream Japanese society from the theoretical to the literal. He had moved from planning apocalypse to attempting to create it. The response was immediate and massive. Within 48 hours of the attack, police launched raids on Aum Shinrikyo facilities across Japan. On March 22nd, officers hit 25 locations simultaneously. Because there were fears that armed cult members might resist with violence, the 1st Airborne Brigade of the Japan Ground Self-Defense Force was stationed nearby, ready to provide military support if needed. Inside Aum facilities, police found what they'd been missing during the earlier investigations. They discovered numerous canisters of toxic chemicals used to manufacture sarin. They found laboratories equipped for chemical weapons production. They found evidence of the Matsumoto attack. They found evidence linking Aum to the Sakamoto family murder and to numerous other crimes that had gone unsolved for years. In May 1995, Shoko Asahara and more than a dozen other cult leaders were arrested in nationwide raids. Several followers began admitting to their roles in various attacks. They told police where to find the bodies of the Sakamoto family. Those metal drums hidden in 3 different prefectures 6 years earlier. They confessed to other murders, other attacks, other crimes that Aum had committed while operating under the protection of religious corporation status. But Asahara himself initially couldn't be found. A massive manhunt ensued. Police searched compound after compound, looking for the man who had ordered the subway attack. The entire nation watched and waited. On May 16, 1995, police finally located him. He was hiding inside a wall in one of Aum's buildings, concealed in a space approximately 3 feet high, about the size of a large coffin. He was sitting in the lotus position, meditating, when officers used a huge circular saw to cut through the steel walls around him. Millions of people watched on television as police in riot gear extracted Shoko Asahara from his hiding place. When they arrested him, Asahara made a statement that would become infamous. "Could a blind person like me possibly do such a thing? I am not a criminal." He was asserting his innocence based on his disability, as though partial blindness somehow precluded masterminding a complex terrorist operation. The trials that followed took years to complete. Asahara himself was on trial for more than 7 years. During most of the proceedings, he remained either silent or muttered to himself incomprehensibly. He never explained his motives. He never acknowledged responsibility for what had happened. He never showed remorse for the 13 dead, for the thousands injured, for the Sakamoto family, for any of it. His defense team argued that senior followers had acted on their own, that Asahara hadn't known about the violent crimes, that blaming him was an attempt to shift personal responsibility to a higher authority. But the testimony of those same followers contradicted this defense. Multiple disciples testified that Asahara had personally ordered the attacks, had been intimately involved in planning them, had been the driving force behind everything Aum Shinrikyo had done. The prosecution presented additional evidence that the attacks were designed to divert police attention from Aum, to create chaos that would prevent the raids, possibly to trigger the apocalypse that Asahara had long predicted. They showed that he had masterminded not just the subway attack, but also the Matsumoto incident, the Sakamoto family murders, and numerous other crimes. On February 27, 2004, the court found Shoko Asahara guilty on 13 of 17 charges. 4 charges were dropped. He was sentenced to death by hanging. Japanese media called it the trial of the century. The defense appealed on multiple grounds, including claims that Asahara was mentally unfit. Psychiatric examinations were conducted. The results showed something interesting. While Asahara remained silent during formal proceedings, he communicated normally with staff at his detention facility. The examiner concluded that Asahara was maintaining his silence out of free will, not because of mental incapacity. His final appeal was rejected in 2011. His execution was postponed in June 2012 because additional Aum members were still being arrested and tried, and authorities wanted all legal proceedings complete before carrying out the death sentence. On the morning of July 6, 2018, Japan executed Shoko Asahara. He was hanged at the Tokyo detention house. He was 63 years old. Along with him, 6 other senior members of Aum Shinrikyo were executed that same day. Men who had carried out the subway attack, men who had helped manufacture the sarin, men who had murdered the Sakamoto family. The 6 executed alongside Asahara that day were Tomomitsu Nimi, who had served as a getaway driver for one of the subway attackers; Kiyohide Hayakawa, Aum's construction minister, convicted of strangling a young cult member in 1989; Seiichi Endo, the head scientist who had worked on biological weapons; Masami Tsuchiya, Aum's chief chemist and director of sarin manufacturing; Tomomasa Nakagawa, a former physician involved in multiple murders; Satoru Hashimoto, martial arts expert and Asahara's bodyguard. 3 weeks later, on July 26, 2018, 6 more Aum members were executed. Yasuo Hayashi, who had released sarin on the Chiyoda subway line; Kenichi Hirose, who attacked the Marunouchi line; Toru Toyoda, perpetrator on the Hibiya line; Masato Yokoyama, attacker on another train; Kazuaki Okazaki, involved in the Sakamoto family murder; Satoru Hashimoto, another member convicted in the Sakamoto killings. 13 people total received death sentences for Aum-related crimes. All 13 were executed in 2018, bringing a final official close to the chapter that had begun decades earlier in a one-bedroom apartment in Shibuya. When news of Asahara's execution reached families of victims, many expressed relief. Kiyoe Iwata, whose daughter had died in the subway attack, told journalists, "This gave me a peace of mind. I have always been wondering why it had to be my daughter and why she had to be killed." 23 years after her daughter's death, she finally had the closure of knowing that the person responsible had faced ultimate justice. But the story of Aum Shinrikyo doesn't end with executions. The organization itself, despite losing its leadership, despite the trials and convictions, despite being labeled a terrorist group by countries around the world, never completely disappeared. In 2000, Aum Shinrikyo officially renamed itself Aleph, a reference to the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. The rebranding was an attempt to distance the organization from its criminal past, to suggest a new beginning, a fresh start. Some members left, but a core group remained devoted to Asahara's teachings even after his arrest. In 2007, Aleph split into 2 factions due to internal conflicts over how to handle the organization's public image and whether to continue venerating Asahara. Former Aum spokesman Fumihiro Joyu, the telecommunications expert who had once worked for Japan's space program, founded a splinter group called Hikari no Wa, which translates to Circle of Light or Ring of Light. Hikari no Wa claimed to be committed to moving away from Aum's violent history, to uniting science and religion, to creating what they called the new science of the human mind. They publicly distanced themselves from Asahara and from the crimes that had been committed in his name. But Japanese authorities remained skeptical of whether this represented genuine change or merely better public relations. Both Aleph and Hikari Nowa remain under surveillance by Japan's Public Security Intelligence Agency. In 2011, the cult reported a membership of 1,030, a fraction of the 40,000 it claimed at its peak, but still over 1,000 people willing to associate themselves with the organization. According to government reports, the group has been active in trying to recruit new members via social media and proselytizing on college campuses. In 2015, authorities announced that both groups would remain under surveillance for 3 more years. When Hikari Nowa challenged this designation in court, the Tokyo District Court initially ruled in their favor in 2017, canceling the surveillance extension. But the government appealed, and in 2019, the Tokyo High Court overturned that decision, reinstating the surveillance. The court's reasoning was straightforward. They saw no major changes between Aum Shinrikyo and Hikari Nowa that would justify lifting oversight. Photographs taken inside Aleph facilities as recently as 2013 showed altars with Asahara's portrait still prominently displayed. Papers were found pierced with a knife, displaying images of Public Security Intelligence Agency employees, police officers, and lawyers who had helped followers leave the organization. The symbolism was clear and threatening. The international community has taken varied approaches to Aum-related organizations. Russia banned Aum Shinrikyo in 2016, officially designating it a terrorist organization. Canada, Japan, France, Kazakhstan, and the European Union have similar designations. The United States had classified Aum as a terrorist organization but removed that designation in 2022, determining that the group was largely defunct and no longer represented an active threat. But the question remains, how did this happen? How did yoga classes become weapons, laboratories? How did a meditation teacher become a terrorist? How did some of Japan's brightest minds convince themselves that manufacturing nerve gas was spiritual work? There's no simple answer, but certain factors become clear when you trace the path from Chizuo Matsumoto to Shoko Asahara to the Tokyo subway. The isolated childhood at the blind school taught him that closed societies operate under different rules, that creating dependency is a form of power, that being the person with sight in a world of blindness makes you a king. The public humiliation of his arrest and bankruptcy showed him that he couldn't succeed in conventional society, that the doors of respectability were closed to someone like him, that if he wanted to be important, he would need to build his own world. The timing of the 1980s in Japan, with economic prosperity creating spiritual emptiness among educated youth, gave him an audience hungry for meaning beyond material success. The religious corporation laws, designed to protect legitimate spiritual practice, gave him immunity from oversight at precisely the moment when oversight was most needed. The charisma and psychological manipulation, the use of drugs during initiations, the isolation of members from families and the outside world, all of these created total dependency on Asahara's authority. And finally, the apocalyptic theology, the belief that the world was ending and only Aum members would survive, created a framework where any action could be justified. If you truly believed that nuclear war was coming in 1997, that 9 out of 10 people would die, that only those following Shoko Asahara would inherit the earth, then making that apocalypse happen yourself didn't seem like terrorism. It seemed like fulfilling prophecy. It seemed like bringing about the inevitable. The scientists who manufactured sarin, the followers who released it in subway cars, the executives who ordered murders, these weren't people who thought of themselves as terrorists or killers. Based on later testimony, many believed they were doing sacred work, that they were helping humanity by destroying it, that killing was actually an act of compassion that freed people from bad karma. This is what makes the Aum Shinrikyo case so deeply troubling. These weren't ignorant people. These weren't individuals with limited capacity for reason. They were scientists, engineers, doctors, educated at the best universities in one of the world's most advanced nations. And yet they committed acts of terrorism that killed and injured thousands. What Aum Shinrikyo revealed is how vulnerable human psychology is to certain forms of manipulation, how easily intelligence can be divorced from wisdom, how completely a closed system can warp the moral compass of those trapped inside it. The combination of charismatic authority, psychological manipulation, social isolation, apocalyptic theology, and gradual escalation created conditions where the unthinkable became acceptable, where murder became meditation, where bringing about mass death became spiritual practice. Shoko Asahara succeeded in creating exactly what he'd learned at the blind school, a closed society, separate from ordinary society, where he made the rules and everyone else obeyed them. The partially blind boy who learned that having even a little sight made you powerful in a world of blindness had, by the end, created a world where he was the only one who could see, where his vision was reality, where his word was truth, where his prophecies would be fulfilled even if he had to fulfill them himself. The man in the lotus position, hidden inside a wall, meditating in a space the size of a coffin. That image captures something essential about what Aum Shinrikyo became. It had started as openness, as spiritual seeking, as the promise of enlightenment and transcendence. But it ended in a tomb, in darkness, in a cramped space where reality was whatever Asahara said it was, where the world outside had ceased to exist, except as a target. When the circular saw cut through the steel and the police pulled him out into the light, when millions watched on television as they arrested the guru who claimed to be Christ, it marked the end of Aum Shinrikyo as it had existed. But the questions it raised haven't been answered. How many people would follow if another Asahara emerged? How many brilliant minds would abandon reason for the promise of enlightenment? How easily could it happen again? The Tokyo subway stations where sarin was released still operate today, carrying millions of commuters every day. People board trains at Kasumigaseki, sit in those same cars, travel those same routes without thinking about what happened there in 1995. Life continues. The city functions. The world keeps turning. But every March 20th, memorial services are held. Victims' families gather at the locations where their loved ones died. Former members of Aum, those who left before the attacks or who have since renounced the organization, sometimes attend these memorials. They stand alongside the families they helped destroy, seeking forgiveness for their role in something they can barely explain even to themselves. The story of how a blind guru built a doomsday cult under Japan's nose is a story about many things. About ambition and failure. About isolation and belonging. About the hunger for meaning in a materialistic world. About the dangers of absolute authority and unquestioned devotion. About how easily the boundary between spiritual practice and deadly violence can dissolve when the right conditions align. It's a story that began with a 6-year-old boy being sent away to a school for the blind, learning early that power comes from creating dependency, that isolation breeds control, that in a closed system you can become king. And it ends with 13 people dead on a subway platform, thousands injured, a nation traumatized, And the question that has no comfortable answer: how did nobody stop this before it was too late? The warning signs were there. Families reported their children missing. A lawyer investigating the organization was murdered along with his wife and infant son. People in Matsumoto died from nerve gas a full 9 months before the Tokyo attack. Neighbors complained about strange odors from Aum facilities. Former members tried to expose what was happening inside the communes, but the religious corporation laws prevented investigation. The cultural reluctance to interfere with spiritual matters created hesitation. The assumption that educated, intelligent people wouldn't be capable of terrorism delayed recognition of what was building. And by the time authorities moved decisively, sarin was already evaporating in subway cars, and it was too late to prevent the tragedy. Shoko Asahara is gone, executed on a summer morning in 2018. But the organization he built hasn't entirely disappeared. Followers still gather, still practice what they call his teachings, still believe in some version of the vision he articulated. Surveillance continues. Authorities watch. And the rest of Japan remembers the morning when meditation classes and murder became the same thing, when yoga studios and terrorist cells turned